Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. It's really great to have you all here. We're very lucky to have Tony with us, who's Managing Director of his company, a Chartered Fellow of the CIPD, and huge amount of experience in work and occupational psychology. He's going to be talking us through the role of psychometrics and work simulation in competency-based selection today. This is facilitated through the HR Users of Psychometrics LinkedIn group. And if anyone is interested in doing any other webinars, then please do get in contact with me. Lovely. Over to you, Tony.
Yes. Hello, everybody. What I'm going to do today is take you through an agenda which looks something like the following, if I can make the slides work. So just bear with me a second while I do that. Here we go. The first 4 items should take about 10 minutes, and then we'll get on to the main thrust of the thing, which is looking at the way that psychometrics can help with competency-based selection, particularly in terms of their predictive validity. So if you're okay with that, then I guess just what we do is move forward. And we're going to look first of all at effective performance. And this statistic I felt you'd be interested in because it was produced by Lombardo and Isinger, otherwise known as Lominger, about 1996, and was really giving us a message that for all the training that you might want to do, actually the balance of performance is down to recruitment. So using the picture in front of you, if you want a racehorse, make sure you know what a racehorse looks like, because you might end up with a donkey. And I think one of the things that struck me with all the discussion going on at the moment about performance appraisal, it could be too late to do performance appraisal if you selected the wrong person in the first place. And in fact, basically, you may be trying to repair damage that's irreparable, in addition to it being too vague and sometimes for various reasons too bad. On the other side, you probably recognize Rembrandt getting the first tweet of performance appraisal, telling him he's been weighed in the balance and found wanting, and how many appraisals where after poor selection are like that. So what's the challenge? Well, I thought I'd paint it like this because it impacts lots and lots of your HR processes right the way through. And it's mainly because the costs are always understated. There are always opportunity costs, normally management time, associated with getting the selection process wrong, and all these other things that tend to come out of the woodwork later on. And of course, if you carry on doing it the way you used to do it and always did it, then Einstein's definition of insanity is exactly that, expecting a different result. And I have to say, I've certainly seen it damaging longer term succession plans. You know, if you get the wrong people in the first place, you might as well not fill up your 9-box grid, because it's just ain't gonna get any better. Because the goal we're trying to fulfill is that one. And of course, selection process and methodology is not the only thing that impacts on that. Fundamentally, if you get your job analysis wrong and you're not familiar with the law as it applies to selection, particularly in terms of equality, then you're unlikely to be very successful other than with a very large bill. But you can start to counteract that by looking for diverse sources of talent. And when I mean that, I mean just casting the net wider, and even thinking about having a sort of Rooney rule for your long list in selection, that from an agency don't actually accept a long list that doesn't include some diversity in it. It gets them away from just producing the same old candidates they can't get off their books, basically. Anyway, selection methodology apart, if your managers are not trained in some of that methodology and being able to follow through with that methodology into employment in things like appraisal, then actually all your good work that you may do in selection technique is not going to be wasted. So in all of that, you've got really 5 things to focus on, and only one we're really focusing on today. I've been presenting this type of presentation to a number of different groups, particularly CIPD groups in the Surrey area, and I was very surprised about the number of people who'd never seen this Johari's window, to me, talks everything about what you're trying to do in selection, and it's basically trying to minimize the number of bits of information that you know about an individual, and that means sometimes persuading them to give up knowledge that they don't want to tell you, but also helping them to understand information they may not know about themselves. And if you look at the diagram, it's really trying to minimize the size of box 4, the unknown area. And for those of you who are familiar with the unknown unknowns, the famous statement that everybody laughs about that was made by Donald Rumsfeld, this is what he was talking about. Absolutely key to getting your selection right, this. And I think it also tells you why it can be quite difficult to be 100% successful in the role. It will never be possible to minimize the area in box 4. And by the way, you'll see Johari is not a fancy name devised by some psychologist from Austria. It's actually Joe Luft and Harry Ingram's names stuck together, a bit like Lominger. This may be familiar to you too. It certainly is some information I've seen over many years, and it doesn't change very much. It's talking about the effectiveness in terms of predictive correlation between various selection techniques and performance in the role. If there's a message from this, it's saying to you, the more you try and shape your selection process around what you need in terms of processes and outputs in the job, the more likely you are to be successful. And if you go right back to the biographical interview, you can see it's not very effective. You might as well go out into the road and put a bag over somebody's head, knock them on the head with a mallet, and end up like the Royal Navy did with pressed people. It just doesn't work. And in fact, I think fundamentally it allows you to hand over control of the process to the candidate, which isn't really the idea at all. So I think you'll find this sort of data around, published by many of the publishers, and this particular one came from Saville and Holsworth. And I sort of recognized this in my career because I was recruiting people at all different sorts of levels, and latterly MBA, MSc type people for a global supply chain. And it was pretty clear to me that what we were looking to do was not only to do the traditional things, that's looking at skills and knowledge and experience, and then if we looked at that, putting them in roles, looking to put them up the learning curve pretty quickly, this wasn't sufficient. And I think what tended to happen was you tended to look at skills, knowledge and experience in the selection process, when really what you were trying to do was look at ability, skills and knowledge. And a lot of behavioral stuff, particularly at lower levels, tended to get a bit ignored. So in my own mind, I sort of put this together and said, what you're looking to do is find out what people have got in the basket. And in doing that, I then sort of shaped it in that way, and then started to think about the behaviors. And the more senior the people you were recruiting, and I think this is something which you may recognize, it is usually behaviors that derail people. It's not their skills and knowledge, which you can refresh and which sometimes get out of date. Normally they're using the abilities they've got. If you're right, the ones you've selected for the role as being appropriate for the role, and they're the ones they've got. And if you've deselected the people who are not going to be able to do that, they're not there anyway. But it's something to do with their personality and the way they deal with other people, particularly at a very senior level. It's also very difficult to measure past experience. You can do it through structured interviews, and that is an important part of the selection process, but it's a very poor predictor. You need something else, and you can't really afford to hire people for the length of time they could have to make an impact to make that decision. It's just too expensive. There's also misunderstandings about what techniques you might use to look at the future. And these are the sort of misunderstandings which you get when you're selecting. So I'll let you have a look at those for a couple of seconds while I take a drink. I'm going to give you the answers and I'll refer back to the questions as I go. Well, people worry that, it's some sort of standard type of exam and there's a pass mark and it's the same exam for everything. Well, it isn't really, because you've got to use tests appropriate for the role and at the right level. And in my opinion, error rate is just as important as the actual numbers they got correct. So I think what we need to do is to be very clear that the things like GMAT is not appropriate when you are trying to recruit at lower levels or even at a very senior level. GMAT is designed for a particular purpose, and that particular purpose is to get people normally onto MBA programs. So if I was using this type of instrument, let's say I'm recruiting for a customer service representative in back office, I could certainly find a test which was very, very appropriate to what the sort of checking work they were doing from the SHL customer service battery, and I might use that with Saville and Holdsworth's occupational personality questionnaire. And there might well be other tools in the administrative battery they had, as well as the customer service one, that I'd want to use for that particular role, but I might not want to use everything. So it's very important, I think, that we select the tools that we're using for what the role actually needs. The other thing that people get worried about is that the tests discriminate between different groups, whether by age, ethnic origin, religion, and so on. And tests, there is evidence that there is a difference between groups. The most one that always sticks in my mind, and it's because it was around when I was trained, was a variation between candidates in Northern Ireland who went to schools which were predominantly run by the Catholic Church and those predominantly run by the Protestants. And there was no doubt the research evidence was showing that the Catholic schools were producing people who were more literate, and the Protestant churches schools were producing candidates who are more literate in the round, so in terms of their means and the standard distribution around them. It didn't mean to say that two candidates didn't score the same. I'm not saying that, but it just meant that there was a definite difference, and the test providers publish that sort of variation, and you should take account of it, and we'll look at that in a minute. The other one favourite, of course, is everybody's dying to get people to practice to get some sort of mythical pass mark. And of course, if everybody practiced, all it would do is shift the mean and slightly alter the norm group. So that doesn't really help. Again, it's just this idea that what you're looking at here is an exam. It's not an exam. It's trying to get a comparative measure of whether this person could do this type of activity in this particular role. I guess finally, on personality traits, I'm referring here to trait tools. I'll talk a bit more about that later. How do personalities change over time? Now, from personal experience, having done this sort of tool many, many times over my career, some do change, some don't, and the ones that do change very rarely change substantially for any length of time, substantially being more than 1 and perhaps 2 standard deviations. And the clue here is, how long can you wait for people to change? I think the answer is you can't wait as long as some people might like. So anyway, so that gives you an idea about response to some of the misunderstandings. And if you're trained properly by a proper test supplier, then you will know these things anyway, and you'll know how to use these tools effectively. But I thought it was worth talking and reflecting about suppliers and what you should be looking for from suppliers, and also the tools they're putting on the market. Well, there's a wide range out there. Every test worth having is registered with the British Psychological Society on their registration log. That doesn't mean to say they are a regulator. Quite the contrary. All they're doing is having a look at every tool that's submitted and saying that it does what it says on the tin. It doesn't mean to say it does what you want it to do. The other key thing for me, that whatever test is on the register, the test user requires people who are using it to be trained to the appropriate standard. Obviously level A for cognitive and level B for both. If they don't, the question has to be asked, why not? And I leave that to your imagination. The best test suppliers offer conversion training for those already holding BPS level B. They will normally supply to all those holding level A. Again, if they don't offer conversion training, or they want to run people through the same sort again, why? You just have to ask the question, it doesn't really seem to make sense other than from a commercial point of view, getting more money out of you. And perhaps the really key one is making sure they make test validity and reliability data available to potential users before purchase, and that it makes sense. It isn't a huge package where the data is hidden on page 120, and when you get there, it's not understandable. So I think most of the outstanding suppliers sell their products as being fit for purpose. I should also just point out that on the personality side, for those of you who don't know, but for those of you who do and need a reminder, in selection, you use trait tools. You don't use type preference tools like MBTI or Golden or the other varieties that are around, because they're not properly normed and they're more about preference. So, quick reminder on that. And then we're going to come on and talking about assessing structured interviews and simulations. I mentioned focus or structured interviews, and I think the techniques to do it are quite well known. I've certainly run assessment centres and development centres and trained people to use them. Let's talk first of all about the criteria you use in structured interviews and simulations. Well, you need some form of competency model, some sort of standard measures of what you're trying to do. It might be a formal model like the one we're going to look at shortly. It might be job analysis. It might be something you can direct from Psychometrics. You might say, well, actually, we've mapped a particular trait tool onto what we need from the role, and in this particular sense, this is what behavior we're going to look for. In my view, that's quite acceptable. More sophisticated companies might object to that, but I think there's a definite way of doing that. And if you do that, you will certainly improve the reliability of your process. But fundamentally, you've got to have people to actually measure what you're doing, and that is where you need competent assessors who are trained together, who are trained to challenge each other, and are comfortable with having their work peer reviewed. And I have to say, it's a bit strange that when you let managers out into the real world to run appraisal systems, that not a lot of organizations actually use the same type of techniques or conduct peer review. We certainly, in my last company, did do a fair amount of quality auditing, but in retrospect, I wish we'd let managers do it. They may have thought they had the time, but you need to make sure that everybody is running according to plan and to the right agenda. Anyway, for those of you who've actually been on assessment centres and development centres, you may be familiar with the technique called observe, record, and then categorise and evaluate. And that's trying to get people to stop categorising and evaluating while they're watching what's going on. And when I was trained in that, people said, oh, you've got to remember orca. And although I'm not that familiar with killer whales, I decided that it was better to put an F on the front and say, look, you've got to remind managers to leave their work and their phone and their laptop and all their personal problems at home and just focus, clear their minds and really concentrate, which means I decided we'd have force. Let the force be with you, F-O-R-C-E, and that seemed to go down quite well. So in a second, we're going to come on to competency models. Apologies for that slight background noise. And I'm going to go through a particular one which I'm familiar with. There are others around, particularly one that Hay used to put out by McBurr, which was done years ago in America, but is very, very similar to what I'm going to show you. And, well, I mentioned them earlier, but here are Michael Lombardo and Robert Eichinger, otherwise known as Lominger, who developed their 67 competency leadership architect model together with a number of helpful descriptors, including career derailers, which are pretty useful for people who don't understand why they're not progressing. And now they've extended it for international cultures. And their work was done in '96. And I understand from a recent presentation that the CIPD did some work in 2016 to revalidate this. So when you come onto it, I think you'll see that some of the things that they're talking about tend to ring true now. Anyway, they had the good fortune to sell their business together with all their tools for $24 million to a well-known recruitment agency, who I'll mention a little bit later on. But I have to say that it was in cash, so they must, somebody saw some value in it. And funny enough, when I was being taught this, this was their definition of competency, which I'll let you read for a second. And lo and behold, it's basket. So I'm really thinking, well, actually, perhaps I should sue them for breaching my copyright until I realised they could defend their action with $24 million. So that's probably not a good idea. Anyway, on the right is their 4th edition of their book, which doesn't look very thick from here because it's in 2 dimensions, but actually there's half an inch of thickness behind that. And because what it contains is everything you need to do to use this particular tool and to help people to manage their own development. And FYI, as you can see, stands for Your Improvement. I think it's now in 6th or 7th edition, and it is available online. For some reason, the 4th edition is frightfully expensive on eBay, so people have clearly got copies and they're trying to get rid of it. But I would have a search around and look for a more recent edition if you're keen. What they do actually, is supply a whole range of tools about talent management, which I won't go through in detail because there are lots of them. And you can fill your cupboard through with folders and sort cards and all sorts of stuff. But the 3 things I really, really like about their model is they've got a role profiling tool, which means you can actually select the competencies that you think are appropriate for that particular role. They also supply an interview guide, so it migrates that profile into an interview template, and then you can select questions that you want to include in the interview. It's actually a big version, a small version, and the smaller version I think is more usable. But they've also got a 360-degree profiler using the same competencies. The other thing that came out of their research was what you probably understand as the 70-20 standard model of learning and development, which everybody talks about, but actually was developed from and for senior executives. The idea being that real work has heat. Now, this does not mean that 70-20-10, in other words, 70% action, 20% coaching, and 10% off-the-job learning applies to all jobs. I think if you were training a surgeon, you might find that's not very appropriate. So this sort of extrapolation of their research into this wonderful model is really a load of nonsense, and you really have to make your own mind up about it. It may well be right for developing senior people, but don't just take it as read for everybody else. Because on the right hand side, taking a chunk out of their FYI book, is the development plan, which has the definitions of competencies, talks about compensators, competence you use for overusing other things, possible causes of overuse, a map of how it all fits together in terms of levels in your career, which are going to come on into a minute, 10 development remedies for any competencies that the individual needs to develop. By the way, not all competencies may be developable, so somebody has to make that choice. And then suggested readings and tapes. So you can see it's quite comprehensive, actually. And if you look on the right-hand side of that screen, that particular page, you'll see what a page out of their book looks like. And this is talking about competency number 53, drive for results. You can't see the clever statement, the quotation there. There's some quite interesting quotations there, but you'll see underneath it describes what makes people unskilled, what skilled looks like, what overskilled looks like, and then a list of numbers, which is actually the competencies that you might use under unskilled for substitutes or overskilled for compensators. So it's giving you choices all within one place. But I guess the quotation that the 2 guys make there is very relevant to what's going on now. The ability of stopping using stuff which got you where you were now and starting using new stuff. And I guess in such a dynamically changing world now, how prophetic that statement was. Anyway, coming on to their diagnostic map, 67 competencies by level and cluster. So level being individual contributor, so your normal sort of, to put it crudely, drones working away in the back office for you, your managers, and then your executives. And there's a clear difference between the leadership required at those two levels. Then within 6 broad factors, which we're going to look at, there are various competencies clustered together. I'm not going to go into that in detail because I want to focus on the next 3 things. Skill rating, the ability of a particular competency to be taught in terms of its skill content. Then its developmental difficulty. And they are different because it's got, you can have something which is a low skill rating and a high developmental difficulty, and you'll see that in a minute. And then shortage of supply, which I don't think many other people talk about. There are 8 of the 67 which they've identified as being very short out there, so you need to go and find them and put extra effort in if it's needed for the job. Of the 67, there are 22 associated with emotional quotient, or if you like, emotional intelligence, and another 22 with a learning agility. So the 2 are not the same, and if you focused on EQ or learning agility, you might miss something you needed from the other, because although there is some overlap, the other realities there isn't as well. So 6 factors are operating skills, energy and drive, etc., etc. And I think you'll see they're quite visibly self-explanatory and different. You might have a question about why courage is split out from personal and interpersonal skills. Well, I think the answer is because the courage bit is when you're under stress. And you'll see when we come on to talking about the individual competencies how that works through. So let's have a look. Let's focus on developmental difficulty and scarcity. Now, by the way, you're going to get a copy of this slide pack, and so you don't have to worrying about developmental difficulty and scarcity. You'll be able to study those and then start to think about what you want to do with them. So we're going to start with the ones that are easiest to develop, and there are reasons for this. First of all, they're quite simple competencies to understand. It's also quite simple to help me understand the coding I'm using. And then we can also make one final point, which may shock you a bit. Well, let's look at the skill level. If you look up here, you will see there's 3 H's here, and basically it's telling us that there's a high skill content with action orientated in both the implementer, manager, and executive levels. That's what that's telling us. We come down to customer focus. It's also saying the same thing here. There's an asterisk, and that asterisk, if you look down here, means it's associated with EQ, emotional intelligence. And if you scan down that list, you'll see that's the only one here which is associated with it. In the same way, if you look at timely decision making, while the skill content is medium, the associated with learning agility is here as well. Now, coming down here, just as an example, here we've got informing, where being able to skill content there, the ability to teach people transferable skills there is medium, but that goes down as you go up into management and also into executive leadership. So the final point I wanted to make is about association with short supply. And none of those are in short supply. But the interesting thing for me, if you presented that list to a manager and said, we found people with those, would you be happy? I think they'd take your arm off. But the point is, those things are not necessarily important at a more senior level. If you only recruited for those, you might well lose out on people who are going to move up the organization. So I think that's quite an important point to take away from this. We're going to come on now into the other area, which is really about this scarcity and harder to develop. So I think in doing that, we need to be clear that I'm not saying that these are the only competencies you need to select. But what I am saying to you is you need to be very mindful throughout this of what this is telling you. So I'll give you a second just to have a look down that list. And you'll see I've changed the colours on the right-hand side, but I've kept one in one colour because immediately we're starting to see that one competency appears on both sides. So on the left-hand side, you have scarce and harder, hardest to develop. On the right-hand side, hardest to develop. Doesn't mean they're scarce, it just means they're slightly, more important. So basically what we're saying is that not all the hardest to develop are scarce. So that's very unfortunate, isn't it? So you've got two problems there to overcome. But you will start to see association with emotional intelligence, learning agility appearing here. So that's where the issues start. Don't want to say any more about that. Just keep that in your mind. You'll see some of these competencies appearing later on. Then I thought what we do is look at the thing from a slightly different angle. What do executives normally have in terms of low skill, high performance? So ones you've really got to look for. And here we have dealing with ambiguity and innovation management, which you may recall were on the previous slide. But in terms of the low skill content, but association with high performance, we have creativity, motivating others, and managing vision and purpose. And I guess those might not be too much of a surprise. On the other side, the surprise might be, well, actually, the most likely weaknesses are the same ones except for one. The likely weaknesses is failure to pay too much attention to managing through systems. Now, they may not be the technical expert with this, but they've got to have somebody close by who is, and they've got to know the right questions to ask. And amazingly, it's harder to develop. You think it might be easier, but I guess it's the sort of advanced technical content which is the issue. Again, you'll see that we've got quite a lot of learning agility and emotional intelligence flags coming up there. Going to look at this a slightly different angle again. We're going to look at it from the 6 factors. And the message I'm trying to get across here is the shape of this easiest to hardest count in terms of the competencies. And you'll see what I've done. When I've got a count of 3 under easiest, I've got one of those that's associated with learning agility and one which is short supply. So that's interesting. As you go down, you'll see that virtually all of these are easiest or easier to develop. And there are some learning agility ones, but nothing associated with emotional intelligence. And if you look on the energy and drive, it's a similar story. Nothing about emotional intelligence here, but the ability to be able to learn to do it is there. Now, if we come on to organizational positioning and strategic skills, immediately you see the shape starting to change. Organizational positioning, it's slightly pushed down more towards moderate to harder, hardest. And one of the emotional intelligence ones comes into play. Once you're into strategic skills, not unexpectedly, the shift is more marked. You've got learning agility ones appearing, but again, surprisingly, only one emotional intelligence one. So this is, I guess, saying that strategic skills are about intellectual horsepower and the ability to use it. But you'll also notice we've got 3 in short supply there. Okay, so the last 2, and this is a bit of a change, isn't it? Suddenly, everything's pushed down to the bottom, really, and there's a lot of emotional intelligence going on in personal interpersonal skills. It's hardly a surprise, it's almost like a definition of it. But we've got learning agility as well, and we've got a little bit of scarcity. Coming over to the courage side, well, it's virtually all learning agility and emotional intelligence, which is why there are specialist tools that look about resilience. I would suggest to you those specialist tools are very useful at a senior level, but frankly, telling somebody who you know already is quite low down and competent in other areas, like the first set I showed you, the ones, the implementer ones, why you would want to suddenly pitch them into being told, 10 or 11 times they're not very good at this and the courage is not one of their strong points. I don't really know. I think they'd probably walk out of the door feeling worse than when they walked in. I thought, therefore, to sort of pull this together, I would talk about the highest 6 ranking competencies of the 22 associated with emotional intelligence. Because you can't select, there's no point trying to look for 20 competencies when you're recruiting. You need to look for the really, really important ones. And you'll see from the colour of some of these that we've already seen these before. In fact, the only one we haven't seen was listening skills, which is actually quite a low-level one and is relatively easy to develop and has quite a high skill content. So, but I guess you don't just look for listening. Here we got conflict, we got sizing up people, which is really talking about getting underneath. Perhaps not even underneath, but you've got to look at what's on the surface and try and look underneath. Dealing with ambiguity. So there isn't a right answer. You've just got to choose the answer which you think is least wrong. And sometimes you have to do that with incomplete data, which is why when I was talking about GMAT earlier, I probably should have said that when I was recruiting master's candidates, I was giving them critical reasoning tests and inductive reasoning tests. And while most of them were doing pretty well on the critical reasoning test, the highest level ones, there were a lot of them who couldn't do inductive reasoning. And this was really one of the differentiators. With incomplete data, they were just struggling. And I think a good test of whether people can deal with the ambiguity and indeed deal with strategic information is dealing with incomplete data and dealing with little data. Just moving on, we've looked at sizing up people, but you've also got to understand them. So it's not just sizing up, which is normally at a quite basic level. It's getting an understanding of when you're trying to resolve conflict and you're motivated, and the whole thing seems to start to loop in together. You'll also notice that the dreaded flags that are appearing here, we've got the hash right the way through. Even though we're talking about emotional intelligence, these are clearly some of the shared ones. So if we go on now to look at it from a learning agility point of view, well, here, funnily enough, 3 of the ones on the other slide appear here. So, which is hardly a surprise, but there are 3 that don't. And one is problem solving, which is almost relating to what I was just talking about. Learning on the fly, which is basically the ability to learn from unfamiliar situations. And you might wonder why political savvy isn't on here, which is one of their competencies. And I think you can understand what that is. That's being able to maneuver around problems as they happen. Well, I think the answer is that they are very much getting yourselves out of difficulty now. They're not about the longer term issues of resolving conflict to make sure you take your agenda forward. They're just really almost hygiene factors. But nevertheless, you've got 1, 2, 3, 6 here, and of those, 3 of them are associated with EQ. And all 3 of those are in short supply. There's a lot of information there, and I guess what I want to leave with you is a slide pack and a chance for you to go back and do some self-study and start to think around how you might use those if you are selecting at a senior level. Because the next thing I want to do is just briefly say, well, how might you associate a trait profile with looking for a particular competency? And I happen to have picked out motivating others, partly because I saw some research a little while ago which talked about the sorts of traits which might be associated with this. And when you're looking for a particular competency in a particular role, you might well sit down and take your STEN scales and say, well, no, I'm not going to set that everybody has to have more than STEN 6, because actually somebody who's so confident of their ability might be overconfident. So what I might do is say, well, I'm really a bit concerned if people are below a certain level, and that's actually a bit above a certain level. But within that, I need some sort of broad band, so I don't start deselecting people rather than selecting people. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Years ago, there was a well-known organisation called British Nuclear Fuels who had a 36 competency model, and I sat in a seminar listening to the mistakes they'd made. They were quite open about it. They said what our problem was, we didn't really weight the competencies, and we found there were so few people who met the level we wanted, the absolute level on all 36. We couldn't find anybody. So what we had to start to think about was having something about a range of acceptability. And when we got the whole picture of the candidate, we had then to consider whether there were some areas where we really, really couldn't take them, or whether we felt they were developable. So all the sorts of things we've talked about over the past half an hour or so, they were having to make those judgments. And in some times they had to take a risk, and sometimes they didn't. But I guess this is what this is saying. You know, if you found somebody who was rating as not very socially confident, well, actually, if they were persuasive in 7, you might think, well, what sort of situations are they not socially confident in? So once they were in a situation where they were confident, could they perform? So, you know, if they were green everywhere else, but they were slightly in the red on social competence, I might be thinking, well, actually, if it's a technical role to motivate others, is motivating other technical people, they might be okay. So it might be worth taking the risk. But in other words, it might not be. If it was purely leading other managers or directors who are very different, it might be totally different. Anyway, this is something out of SHL's OPQ. They're saying that for somebody to be able to motivate somebody, probably they've got to come across as being quite an optimistic person who can make their mind up relatively quickly. So people are not wondering what's this person doing. They've probably got to be able to be pretty interested in how other people behave, so they know which buttons to press. We don't want them being over immodest. In other words, we don't want them talking about themselves all the time, but neither do we want them to hide their light under a bushel. So we need something perhaps in the middle, but perhaps pushing towards somebody who's prepared to talk about themselves a bit. But we'd also like somebody who's pretty socially confident, so they come across as well on first impressions. But we do need them to be able to persuade people to follow them. So I was suggesting there that those 6 traits might be indicators that this person has that competency, but you would match that with information from other sources, like a focused interview, like a work simulation. And I'm sure those of you who've done assessment centres and development centres are very, very familiar with that. But it does mean that you're starting to use psychometrics as predictors. It's quite difficult, as I said earlier, to rely solely on focused or structured interviews, because inevitably the candidate will take some control over the agenda. So, managing potential. Last 10 minutes or so, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, once you've got this information, what you've got the individual, you think you've got the right one, how do you go about managing their potential? Well, I thought this was something which, from your own personal point of view, you should be thinking about for managing your own careers. The right-hand side, because you probably know the saying from Karl Paul Reinhard Neuber. The other thing's drawn from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. This is the famous knight who's fighting and he loses one arm, 'tis but a scratch, then ends up losing all 4 limbs and wants to call it a draw. Now that's very noble and brave, but actually, you know, he's run out of capacity to do what we want him to do, or her. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about managing your own basket, and introduce something some of you may know about, which is managing your chimp, and then talk a bit about something about elastic bands, which is my take on this. Well, we talked about the basket, we talked about what goes in it. How do we change what's in our basket? Well, if you're not familiar with Dr. Steve Peters' book called The Chimp Paradox, what he's basically doing is introducing the neuroscience principles by using a basic model of the mind. And it's a working model, and that's the strength for me, that trying to introduce neuroscience into business, I think that's hard work. It's like asking the managing director to be particularly interested in how this wonderful new computer works. It's not going to happen. If you can find something that talks about the ability to manage change, both at an individual and collective level, I think you might get somewhere. So this is probably the best 11 or 12 pounds worth of expenditure that you could make in Easter week. So I really strongly recommend it. And what he basically says, he's talking about the way we receive data and how we process it. And he's basically saying the brain's in 3 parts. It comes in, it's emotionally processed, the first instance, which is why marketeers do what they do and why politicians do what they do. Then it goes into their computer, and at some point it then goes into the human mind, the intelligent mind, to make sense of it from an intellectual point of view. But the reality is the emotional mind can put stuff into your head first, which is difficult to get out. So it has to be managed. And the ability to change the way you think and the way you do things is a lot about reprogramming your mental computer. And the first 64 pages of this book are excellent. If you can't get hooked by that time, then you should put it down, but I suspect you will actually be hooked. And the way I like to look at it is that in terms of managing your own potential, and the trouble is these days, because I'm so old now, people don't recognize the pictures, but this is Gary Player, the famous golfer from the 1960s, who was as famous as Tiger Woods was 20 years ago, and as Tiger Woods is about to become again, I gather, for the Masters tournament at the end of the week, but we'll see. He is a fanatical player. He is fanatically fit. I think he's about 80 and has been tested, has got the body of a 50-year-old. So he's got talent, he's had the opportunity, he's got tremendous drive, and he practices all the time. This was him playing in the Senior Pros tournament a couple of years ago. So other people have stolen this saying, but it was his originally. But the key thing here, opportunity drive is one thing, but if you haven't got the talent, you know, don't get people trying to do things they just can't do. Focus on the positive things. Because when you're trying to develop somebody, how much stretch potential have they got? Some people may have a very, very long elastic band, which in one competency, which in fact is so long they try and use it for everything. But some people's elastic band may be very short in terms of their stretch potential, and if you try and pull it too hard, it may break, and whatever that means could be quite detrimental to them. And the way I look at it, if you say you put two matchsticks or two stakes in the ground far apart, if somebody has a very long elastic band, then telling them they're going to go from one to the other by putting the band between the two, well, you know, the long band, no sweat. You know, if the things are slightly further apart and perhaps the band is no longer, then actually, it's comfortable still, you know. And actually, if the band is broad enough to exactly fit, I'm still in control, I'm comfortable. And from what Lominger told us, you need to be stretched to develop. So this is being taken out of the comfort zone, but not being taken to the point where you're so stressed that you can't carry on. And I think sometimes that is lost. Yes, take people into the discomfort zone, but it has to be managed. I sometimes get surprised. You see on TV people being taken to bungee jump. And I can understand bungee jumping. I wouldn't want to do it myself because actually I'd be scared doing it. But I know it wouldn't have any effect because the elastic band is not so long that you're going to kill yourself, hopefully. So actually it may have an initial impact, but it might just be a waste of time. But what the key thing is, it is managed. You may be a bit stressed, but actually somebody else has got it under control by coaching, by mentoring, by instructing. And I think I wanted to present a bit like this, pushing the ball up the hill. There's a song called Beware of Darkness by George Harrison. If you don't know it, there's a wonderful concert in the memory of George Harrison, where Eric Clapton sings this song. I think he'll give you the message, you know, beware of other people taking a place where you shouldn't go. Similarly, just because you get the boulder to about the top doesn't mean it's over, because actually the diagram that shows before, once you've got it there, there's actually some maintenance tasks to be done, a series of breaking it down into manageable chunks and then finishing it off before you do the next one, which is the general message that you can't really focus on more than about 2 or 3 developmental activities at once. It just gets too much. So, you know, I didn't want to repeat all of this. What I wanted to say was that in helping people manage their potential by relevance to their basket and the competencies and particularly the behaviours in it, They must have some form of big goal. Just make sure you're focusing on the right goal if you can, because the outcome, if you do, will be very good. If they've got a big goal which is a total mismatch, then it won't. And I have to tell you that I've been in situations with career management sessions where people have had that sort of different idea, gone away, pursued it, and regretfully they've lived to regret it. They've gone off somewhere else and it hasn't worked for them, and it hasn't worked for them in a very short time frame, which is very disappointing. So effectively that was the agenda, and thank you for your attention, and I hope you get something out of this, and I hope you spend some time actually going back and looking at it. So without further ado, I will say goodbye to you and thank you very much for attending.